But so we're going to hear a number of wonderful speakers tonight talk about how this book influenced them. And we're going to start, I'm going to just introduce everyone first, and then we'll go right into the series. June Cummins is a professor at the National Center for the Study of Children's Literature, that department at the San Diego State University, and she's currently working on a biography of Sid Taylor, the author of the series. So she has wonderful content for us to look at, much of which is really, really, really exciting, and for those of you who are familiar with the series, will add another dimension to what you're hearing. Anna Holmes is the founding editor of Jezebel and a columnist at the New York Times Book Review. Rebecca Traister is a senior editor at the New Republic and writes about politics and gender, and is working on a new book on free love? Unmarried women. The reason I thought of that, no, it's a mistake, but it makes sense. There's a context for it. Because she was going to be part of a program on Emma Goldman, who was talking about free love, and that's my, sorry. And that's just another way for me to advertise the wonderful panoply of offerings we have here at the Tenement Museum. It was a planned mistake. Hasia Diner, who joins us all the time in many different capacities. Hasia Diner has come and she has advised us on the new exhibits we're working on. She's helped us revise exhibits we already have and works a lot with our educators. She has written about Irish immigration, German immigration, Jewish immigration, and all of it together. And her newest book on peddlers, on Jewish peddlers, is coming out in February from Yale University Press. And Lizzie Skurnick is a critic, poet, essayist, blogger, author, and teacher, and most of all, the publisher responsible for bringing out the series again. So we're going to start with June, and then after June speaks, the rest of the panel is going to come up and share their favorite stories. So please join me in welcoming everybody to the Tenement Museum.
So, hello. I have 15 minutes, so I hope I don't speak too quickly. If I do, just say, well, slow down. Okay, so I'm June Cummins, and I work at San Diego State University. And, of course, I read Sid Taylor's books when I was a child. And I came back to them when I was planning a children's literature course, and I decided to include All of a Kind Family in the course. And I found that absolutely no one had done any scholarship on Sid Taylor. You know, when you're a professor and you're planning a class, you go to see, the research you do is to see what people have written. Nobody had written anything except for entries in reference books. And there certainly wasn't a biography. So I decided I would do scholarship on Sid Taylor, and I began to do that. And then I found out the name of her daughter, which is Jo, and I queried her and asked if I could write the biography, and she interviewed me and met with me and told me I could. So I've been, she's very graciously hosted me in her home many times so I can go through her mother's materials. So I'm going to give you a little taste today of the kind of research that I've done for the biography. Before I start, though, I want to thank the Jewish Women's Archive and the Tenement Museum very much for hosting us, and most of all, Lizzie Skurnick for bringing back the books and bringing us all together and enabling my work, too. So thank you very much. Okay, so let's see. Is it up here? Okay. So what I'm going to show you are materials from the parts of the biography I have written, which is a chapter about the parents in Europe and all of the children's youth in the Lower East Side, and then later in the Bronx. And right now I'm working on Sid Taylor when she was in her 20s, which was in the 20s, because she was born in 1904. Okay, so this is the mother's family. The mother, her name was Celia Marowitz, and they called her Silly, and that didn't have the connotation that we have for that word. She was born in a town that was at that time part of Russia, sometimes it's part of Poland, but her family emigrated to Germany when she was only 2 years old. So Sid Taylor's mother grew up in Germany, speaking German, and identified as a German person. Her father was in a business of recycling woolens. Basically, he would take in huge amounts of material, and then he had a 20-woman staff sorting the materials, and it was basically a recycling business. So they were living in Germany in comfort, in Bremen, and definitely middle class, and definitely having no poverty. The father, on the other hand, came from a small town in Poland called Wisnice, which is outside of Krakow, and it's still there. And what the town was known for then, the industry was making brushes out of pig skin and pig bristles. And that was what all the Jewish people in the town worked on, ironically. And I have a friend who is from Poland, and I mentioned the town, and she goes, "Oh yes, that town is known for its leather." So it's, to this day, that's what that town is known for. He didn't want to go into that business, so he decided to follow his brother, who had emigrated to Bremen, Germany. And he went to Germany, and Cynthia Taylor's mother was 12 at the time, and she looked out the window and she saw a horrible-looking man walking down the street because he looked like such a country bumpkin. So to make a long story short, it took a long time for them. They liked each other, but they couldn't marry because he had to work to pay for his sister's dowries and back and forth. But finally, they got married. So this is her family. I don't have a picture of his family. And the father started a junk business coming out from his father-in-law's business, but things became too difficult for Jews. They were in Hanover then, and the father really wanted to leave and go to the United States. So they moved to the United States. Oh, this is the pictures of them at the time they became engaged. That was in 1898. So they moved to the United States, and the first daughter, Ella, all the girls in the book are actually their names in real life. Ella was born in Germany in 1900, and subsequently all the other children were born in the United States. If I had a pointer. Okay, so the one with the long hair, that's Ella. And the one in the front with the blonde short hair, that's Sarah, who is Cynthia Taylor. She's the third daughter. To the far, I guess you're right, that's Henny, who was as wild in real life as she is in the books. And that's Charlotte in between them, and the baby at the top is Gertie. So this was the family that you see in the books. Subsequently, the mother had 3 different sons, 2 of whom lived to adulthood. One died in childhood. So you all know Charlie, but that was really Irving. But that's another story. But this was before Irving. And I want to play you an audio clip here. One of my primary source materials are tapes, audio tapes that Ella and Charlotte made when they were elderly. And they recounted their memories, which you can imagine it was an incredible resource for me. But I want you to hear a little bit of them talking to get a sense of the contentiousness.
She would never take the bottle until Charlotte came, sneaked the bottle, went under the bed, finished the bottle, and put it back into Gertie's hand.
I only did that once.
Well, I don't know. You were a tiny...
I recall having done it.
How could you recall having
because
done
I
it?
remember
Because you were only 16 months old when she was born.
I recall Mama saying to Papa how wonderful it was and how strange it was that Gertrude never had finished a bottle before, and this time, look, she finished the bottle. And I was feeling very guilty about it.
Yeah, but you did it more often. Anyway.
So it's a treat to listen to the audio tapes. Okay, so they lived on the Lower East Side for several years. It was really difficult for Mama because she went from being a bourgeois German young woman to being impoverished. And they were impoverished for many years. And they came to the United States and they lived in poverty for quite a while. The father was trying to start a business and get his business going, but it took a long time. And a lot of serious stuff happened then that I can't go into now, but that was a difficult time of their lives. And that's the time that is depicted in the books. Okay, so they moved to the Bronx. Eventually, the father made enough money that they could move to the Bronx. Sarah and all of her sisters, except Gertie, had started school at PS 188, which is still here in the Lower East Side, and but they moved to the Bronx. I think the ages are a little off. This says her graduation was in 1918, but there's a dress in her daughter Joe's basement, an actual dress that says graduation 1916, and the dress looks exactly like that dress. So it's a little confusing, but she was at PS 20 in the Bronx, which I don't think is there anymore. And then I couldn't find it. It sort of changed, it shifted names and stuff. Then she went to Morris High School, which is a famous high school in the Bronx, and it was the first coeducational high school in United States, or in New York, probably in the United States. Morris High School for 2 years, and she left before she graduated, which was very common. In fact, it was very unusual for kids at that point in history to be graduating. This was the first generation that was going to high school, and she left school to work. When she got to high school, though, she really made the most of it, and she was very active and social, and she became the president of the Spanish Club and also the fourth-term representative, and it was a really good 2 years for her. She started keeping a diary in, I don't know if you could see the date. It says begun August, I think it's 1916. It was 19, right. Okay, so in this diary, this is the very first page of the very first diary, and she's 15, and 19, she writes, "My thought book, Sarah Brenner." By the middle of the diary, she's referring to herself as Sydney. So she changed her name as she started, very shortly after she started the diary. Much later in her life, when she was asked, "Why did you change your name?" she said, "Oh, well, I joined an acting troupe," which was much later, "and they told me to change my name." So I don't know if she didn't remember that this is when she changed her name, but I take this name change from Sarah Brenner to Sydney Taylor as sort of the issue, the way that my biography works around this issue of the name change, because I see it as reflecting three major issues in her life. One is Judaism and Jewish assimilation. Sarah is a Jewish name, and in fact, it was the only one of the five sisters who had a biblical name. Sydney, some of you might think of it as your grandfather or great uncle, but actually it's not a Jewish name. So and that's what she was implying when she said the acting troupe told her to change her name. The second issue is gender and sexual identity and feminism. Those are major issues in her life, and she picked a gender-neutral name. And to this day, people tell me they thought she was a man. And I've read countless fan letters where they say, "Dear Mr. Taylor." So that's a major issue in the book. And the third is artistry. She recalled changing her name for artistic purposes, and that was her stage name and her pen name. So those are how I kind of wrap up the three main issues in the book. Okay. So this is a page from the diary, and it's typical in the way that it looks, the way that it's focusing a lot on a guy that she's met. Most of the early diaries are about men, and she had a lot of suitors who sent her hundreds and hundreds of letters. But I like this entry because it's the first time she goes to a meeting of the Young People's Socialist League. A lot of young people in New York, Jewish people, were socialists. This is her first meeting. And she meets this guy, Ben, and she admires Ben, but it turns out it's his cousin that she's eventually going to hook up with. So she was very active and busy in the 1920s. This was an era when women were entering the workforce as professionals or semi-professionals, as opposed to working in factories and sweatshops. Now they were working in offices and stores, and they had a little bit of leisure and money, and these are the kinds of things they were doing. Social, hanging out, going to the beach, and here she is at Brighton Beach. So then, I'll go through this quick. This is supposed to designate that she had a lot of different male suitors. but eventually she ends up with Ralph, who she meets at a Yipsel meeting, and they had a pretty stormy beginning. It's not clear when they got married, whether it was 1925 or later, but it was sometime in that decade. There's different documents attesting to different times. But then they were married, and they had a very long and a wonderful marriage. Okay, so she took a lot of classes after she left school, and this is a letter from Lee Strasberg, who was one of her teachers, and from taking classes wherever he was at that time, my regards to Ralph, she became a stage actress, and she was in a group called the Lenox Hill Players, and she was in several plays, and she was written up in reviews, and you can tell by these pullouts that she was getting rave reviews. But she didn't continue with the acting. She shifted to dancing. And the person she danced with was Martha Graham. And she was in, this is to show you all the places that they were performing. This was Martha Graham's first dance troupe. That's a famous dance that Martha Graham did called Heretic. So I did interview, when I started the project, only one sibling was remaining, which was her youngest brother. And he told me, oh, Sid didn't really dance with Martha Graham. She just took classes at her studio. But it's obvious that he was wrong because her name is in every program that I found from that, she kept them. And it's interesting when you read these names because, Lillian Shapiro, Sophie Maslow, Anna Sokolow, like if you know dance and you know New York culture, you might know those names. But really the most famous person in that list of names, nobody would even recognize there, is Sidney Brenner. Way more people know who Cynthia Taylor is than know who Sophie, Maslow. I can't even. Right. Which is not to, not to be mean to those guys. But she was the most famous person from Martha Graham's earliest group. Okay. She danced with this group until she became pregnant with her daughter, Jo. And she did name Jo after our favorite Jo, Marge. And so I'll quickly tell you how that segues into her writing the books. Jo was an only child, and she often felt lonely. Her mother would tell her stories at night. This is sort of the official story that's in the reference books. And then Jo said to her at one point, Mom, how come all the books you read to me have Christian children and no Jewish children in them? So Jo was the instigator of Cynthia Taylor writing the first books that had Jewish children that were published by a mainstream publisher, which was Follett. And the story goes that the husband sent the manuscript that she had typed up but had stuck in a drawer. He sent it to the Follett contest, and she came home, and there was a letter and a shock that she had won. And then Mr. Follett himself called her on the phone and said, "You've won the contest, and we're publishing your book." So that was 1951. So she then publishes from then and through the 70s. And of course, in the book, I'll be talking about what an important, significant impact Cynthia Taylor had on not just children's literature, not just Jewish identity, which Hasia has pointed out. She really did affect Jewish identity in America, but really all of us. I mean, she made a big difference in being one of the first authors to publish any ethnic children's literature at all. And her legacy is really important, and we have Lizzie to thank to make sure that her legacy continues. And I hope that you'll want to read the book when it comes out. So, wait, there's one more. Go, Sid.
I'd like to invite Hasia and Anna and Rebecca to take a seat and share their stories. We'll start with Hasia and the library. I'd also just take a seat and share the microphone. And I'd also like to invite Alana and Esther to come and take seats where they were sitting.
Do you want us to actually read the story?
Oh, if you'd like, yeah, that's a good. Our young readers. A few minutes.
Oh, okay. Do I need the microphone?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, so I'm going to tell one of the stories from the original book, but I will say that it so resonated to me reading this. I believe I must have been 7 or so. Like Annie, I grew up in Milwaukee, and so there was a certain sense of being a real minority, and there were certainly no books in the library that had anything that kind of I felt like, quote, saw myself in. Obviously, there were lots of Jewish children's books, but you didn't get them in the public library. And I just sort of picked this off the new book tray in the Norris Library on Center Street, and I just looked at the cover, and I knew this was it. And there was nothing on the cover that would tell you, but I got it. So the story that meant the most to me as I thought about it once I got this assignment was called The Library Lady. And the reason, again, I can remember this as a 7-year-old, is like the girls in the book. My sister and I only went to the library. We went to the Friday afternoon was library time, and you get the stack of books for the whole week. And so where does the story start? But it was Friday afternoon. Mama was cooking, and they're off to the library. So there was just this immediate kind of resonance. Well, it's a crisis because why? One of the girls can't find her book because she lost the book, and the question, there was going to be a fine. Now, again, it really resonated to me as a kid who always lost things and lost library books. And how was I going to tell my parents that I'd lost the library book? So all the girls go to the library, and it's actually, I believe this is the first story in the first book. And the librarian, who I want to say something about in a second, as maybe a historical figure, immediately says, "Oh, sometimes I see you're all sisters. Sometimes these are called step, a sort of step family." And one of the girls says, "But they call us all of a kind family." And so it set the tone for the idea that they had so much in common. The librarian worked out a kind of schedule for them to pay the fine, which was $1, which was actually a lot of money. And so not only did they, fess up that they had, the girl that she'd lost the book, and the librarian was able to create a system by which they could pay, but Sarah could still take out books because that was her great fear. She wouldn't be able to take out any books until she paid.
Hi. Is this good? Is this good volume? Okay. So I'm half Jewish, and I grew up in the suburbs of Philadelphia, and I was so acute and half Jewish and with like almost no religion. My dad was a Jew whose parents had emigrated to the Lower East Side and then moved to the Bronx, and my mom is a Baptist potato farmer from Maine. And the result was we didn't celebrate Jewish holidays. There was very little Jewish tradition. There were two, but I was super aware of my identity as a Jew because in the suburb where I was raised, which was blue-collar Irish Italian, I was the only Jew. Like, I might as well have been. I mean, I was the Jewishest person for miles around, which makes you hyper aware of your identity, right? Traister. And so there were two real ways, though, that as a child, that my Judaism was made apparent to me. One, we had candlesticks, and even without we never celebrated Passover, we didn't celebrate Yom Kippur, there was no knowledge of any of these things, I didn't understand what they were, but every Friday night my mother lit candles, my Baptist potato farming mother lit candles, and we said Good Shabbos to everybody. And because my father was from New York, we were always in the city, and we came and we ate bagels and lox, and I was certainly the only person on the planet, as far as I was concerned, who ate smoked salmon and fish for breakfast. And so I was hyper aware of this. And of course, I was a voracious reader. And there was, until a little later when there was Margaret and Sally J. Friedman, there was nothing about Jews, right? I didn't. Which I didn't have again in my life. I had never had until I was an adult. Like recently now, hot chickpeas are very hot. You can find them in many restaurants, farm to table. And I'm like, yeah. And I'm like, chickpeas. But that was not like a food that was even remotely recognizable to me at the time, but it stayed with me. And that chapter and the idea of there being this open public space where there were these delicious kinds of food that were totally foreign to me as a kid in the way that the kind of food that I ate with my family was totally foreign to my social world and community around me, stuck with me so powerfully. And I didn't think about how powerfully it had stuck. I knew that later in life, as I got older, somebody who would become one of my favorite writers is Calvin Trillin, and he was writing about the food down here in ways that stuck with me. So that's how I knew about Ben's Dairy and Gus's Pickles and Russ and Daughters. When I started my newest job at the New Republic, one of the first stories I wrote, Russ and Daughters, is celebrating 100 years, and I wrote about Russ and Daughters' history and the way that, and in fact, the way that the business was passed down to the daughters because there were 3 daughters, and that's why it's Russ and Daughters, and I think it's one of the first businesses that had daughters in the name. Anyway, it stuck with me so powerfully, the connection between food, culture, and identity and foreignness that I could identify with. And at the same time, it also, I should say, provided my only religious education as far as how Jewish holidays work. Like, to this day, if somebody asked me about Purim, I sort of go back to the book I read when I was 7, and I'm like, well, this is how I think it works. There are baskets. You take them to neighbors. You dress up as boys. Anyway, so that's my favorite memory.
I'm trying to think when I first read All the Kind Family. I believe I was about 9 or 10, and it was given to me many years prior, but I wouldn't read it because I didn't like the cover. Covers were very important to me, as Lizzie knows, about, in terms of chapter books and then later young adult books. And it was a weird puce screen color with some purple on it, and it just didn't seem very attractive. But it was a gift, I think, for my parents, and they never talked about the book. I don't know if they actually read it. They may have just known it was a classic and decided to give it to me. But I eventually read it because I got sick of reading the books that I already had on the bookshelf. And I am not Jewish, and I didn't grow up in a community that had a lot of Jewish families. I grew up in Northern California, and there was one synagogue, and there were maybe 2 kids I knew of in my elementary school who were Jewish. It was very white. I'm not white, but it was very white there. And I think that what attracted me to the book was not just the idea that there was this family of all girls, which I was really jealous of. I don't have any brothers. I have a younger sister, but there were 5 girls, and that seemed like so much more fun than having one annoying little sister. You could kind of like spread the angst around if you had 4 other sisters. But also, I think what struck me was that it was describing not only a time but an environment that I had no idea about. I had never been to New York at that time. I mean, obviously this was the 70s or the early 80s when I read it, and the New York of the Lower East Side was not similar to the one in the book. But the idea that there were people with shops, and you walked around and you went into stores and you bought things, you knew the name of the grocer or you knew the name of the woman at the candy store, and that there was a sense of community, which there really wasn't in Northern California, maybe because of the era, but also because it was a car culture. So we didn't really interact with people that often. So that was one thing that attracted me, that the fact that there were the 5 girls and that this was a story of girls. I was certainly not a reader who only wanted to read stories about girls. I could read stories in which boys were the protagonists. But it was always a special relief to me when I read stories that had females as protagonists, and especially the females who lived in New York City. I was really kind of fascinated by New York, and it wasn't just All the Kind Family. It was Harriet the Spy, which is one of my favorite books, and Judy Blume books. But the one chapter that sticks out to me the most has this kind of weird title that doesn't really tell you what is to come. It's called Who Cares If It's Bedtime? And it's similar. It actually comes, I think it's the chapter right before the chapter that Rebecca just mentioned. The reason that it resonates with me is because children's chapter books that I loved the most, even when they bore no resemblance to my life or they were set in a completely different time, they talked about food. And I really liked books that talked about food. The Laura Ingalls Wilder books talked about food in a way that was so fascinating. I mean, I still to this day have always wanted to get, I guess it was maple or sap, or like put it in snow and pouring it on the snow and then eating it like candy. I've never done that, but I have memories like that. And from this chapter, I have memories of 2 of the daughters going, saving up their pennies and going to a candy store, and then to, I think, a more kind of general grocer. And at the candy store, they hemmed and hawed over what candies they were going to buy, and then settled on some chocolate babies. And at the grocer, they got a bag of broken crackers. But the way that she writes about the food, it almost makes my my mouth water even now, even though I haven't tried most of the things that she talks about. And also the way that she describes, like, everything is very tactile and very tasty in this chapter. She's talking about, Charlotte uncurled the fingers of her right hand and showed Gertie 2 pennies lying warm and moist in her palm. I mean, even that. I mean, yes, there were pennies around in the 70s, but they weren't worth anything, even when I was young. So and people were really writing checks back then, like just the tactile nature and the kind of the simplicity of life, which I didn't have. And I'm not complaining, but I didn't have in the same way that these kids did. But I marked some of the things, the food items in this book, which I just like to read the words. There were Indian bars, which were chocolate-covered peanut bars. There were licorice drops. There were red cherry hearts, yellow and orange chicken corn candy, black jelly beans. There's a little debate over how they do like the black jelly beans. There's lemon drops, chocolate pennies, caramels, and then in this part of the chapter, they eventually settle on the little people made out of chewy chocolate-colored candy. Now, I've never seen chocolate babies then, and I have never seen them now, and maybe they exist. No, because they're shaped like little people.
Yeah, but the texture of Tootsie Rolls?
Maybe.
Because I think in there... I don't know. I was just curious.
I would. I mean, it's possible that there's a candy. They're a little grainier. It's possible that they're still manufactured and sold somewhere in New York, and maybe I should just go find them. But later they go to the grocer, and there's Mr. Bosch who only speaks Yiddish, and there's a big barrel of crackers, and they get a bag of crackers, and then just for a treat, Mr. Bosch walked over to the back of the store where he kept slabs of smoked salmon. He called it lox, and cut off 2 pieces of moist, salty skin. This was a rare treat. So this chapter is just, I love it because of the food, but also because later in the chapter, the 2 girls have their booty, so to speak, that they've collected, and they hide it under the bed, and then their mother comes in and puts in some hot irons at the bottom of their bed to keep their feet warm. Another thing I didn't realize was a thing, which sounded much better than my mom just turning on the heat, and then spent the night eating crackers and eating candy and thinking their mother wouldn't notice, and of course there were crumbs in the bed the next morning. But I really felt very attached to the girls in this book, and I felt very attached to the idea of the closeness of a Jewish family. The idea of New York, just things that I didn't have as a kid, and that continued on into my adolescence. I had this thing where I wanted to move to New York, and I wanted to have grown up in New York as a young Jewish girl, and I moved to New York, but the other stuff didn't happen. So. So that's my favorite part of the book. Yeah, there's the picture of them talking in bed. Yeah, there's just something fun about girls like talking in bed late at night together and like slumber parties, sisters. Yeah, and just plotting, and I guess in their case eating.
As Hasia said, I grew up in Wisconsin, and so it's funny, the first big book that I remember reading in first grade was Little House in the Big Woods, which took place in Wisconsin, and I loved it. But then I moved on to Little Women and an abridged version in second grade or something, and I loved it, but I had no idea what Pilgrim's Progress was and all those chapters, and so I came to All of a Kind Family after all of that, and that was this really wonderful relief of finding home. And I want to invite now Lizzie Skurnick, who has brought back all of these books, to say a few words and to ask some questions of the audience, of our panelists, and then we'll open it up to everyone so that they too can share their All of a Kind Family story. Thank you, everyone.
Hi, I really have nothing to say because actually everyone has covered Little House on the Prairie and the crackers, and the only thing I can bring up is the mustache cup and the importance of that. And so I just want to thank all of you for coming and for the wonderful book. And I want to thank June also for letting me know that they'd gone out of print. We would not have them otherwise. And I would like to, I guess, I'd like to start the panel off with sort of a serious question, and then I'd like to invite everybody in the audience to come ask their questions up at the microphone. So I was actually always interested in the politics of the book, and how as a young girl I wanted to know, did you guys notice World War I? Did you notice polio? Did you notice the bigger issues that are coming up, and how that changed when you read them as an adult?
Well, I certainly I certainly noticed the polio because I'm much older than these two people, so I lived through the polio epidemics, and I remember several years where school was closed until November because of the fear of kids catching polio. And so it was very powerful, and I got the World War I, even though obviously it was much later than that, but my parents had lived through World War I and talked about it. But in a sense, those stories made it so contextual that these were set in a very specific moment in time. And even the moving from the Lower East Side to the Bronx, even though I couldn't have known it then, but obviously such an important phenomenon as this neighborhood lost population generally, but also particularly lost its Jewish population to what was suburbanization at the time.
I do have a memory of World War I I was young because I went on to read the others, right? I don't know at what age, probably sometime between the ages of 8 and 10, I read all of them. And so World War I comes in what, the second or the third? I mean, I know they were written sort of out of order too, but Jules, Ella's boyfriend, goes off and fights in World War I, which is mostly the context for it. I was again, obsessed with my Jewishness and neurotic about the Holocaust, and obsessed with World War II and World War I remember reading it and being like, World War I didn't know anything about the history at that point. Like, is that like World War II? Is that like the thing that I think about at night in the middle of the night? So I do remember it in that way. But actually, the political thing I remember the most is in Ella of All of a Kind Family. Is it okay if we do spoilers?
Yeah.
Okay.
Has anyone not read the book and attended?
The last book, Ella of All of a Kind Family, it's actually, and I didn't know a lot about Sid Taylor until more recently, but Ella seems to live out a good deal of Sid Taylor's life and wants to have a stage career and be on vaudeville, and she gets very torn in that book is mostly about her being torn between marrying Jules, her boyfriend, and having this stage career that's become available to her. And I do remember, the only thing I can tell you about my age is I was still in elementary school because the memory is so visceral I was sitting in the lunchroom not going to recess finishing this book, horrified by the way that she embraces, like, I really love doing dishes, and that's where I'm going to find my happiness, and I'm not going to find my happiness on stage. And I remember, like, I know I was in my elementary school cafeteria reading this, like, are you kidding me? So in that way, that's my political memory of it.
Well, it's good you're writing the book you are writing now about unmarried women and free love. Lizzie, I don't know that I have any memory. I mean, I remember like mentions of polio, but I don't remember the stuff about the war because World War I didn't mean anything to me. World War II meant Hitler, right? But World War I didn't mean anything to me as a kid. And I think if there's anything I remember, it was some of the, maybe gender politics isn't the right word, some of the expectations of the women, like Ma. I shouldn't say Ma. It's not Little House on the Prairie, but she plays that game with them where she wants them to dust the room.
Yes,
with the buttons, and she's hiding buttons, and there's some line in that chapter about how they were going to be the best little dusters maybe in all of New York or all the Lower East Side, and I think at the time I kind of rolled my eyes, and then as an adult I read it again and rolled my eyes even more. So just like kind of like the ways they were being trained to be little housewives. That said, there's no indication in their personalities that they're necessarily going to go along with this. I mean, they're very headstrong, and they each have their own personality. So I didn't feel like they were little robot children, like they weren't Stepford children, nor is the mother a Stepford wife. But I noticed that stuff more, I think, than any of the kind of external forces, or some of her language describing people. And this is actually when I was an adult more than when I was a kid. I think she describes one of the peddlers who comes into the dad's junk shop is like swarthy. He's a swarthy Italian. So there's stuff like that where now I'm like, But that's really kind of about it.
Okay. I do always call these books the Jewish Little House on the Prairie. And I guess I was interested in, I just totally blanked on what I was interested in. The swarthiness. No, the portrayal of the Jewish holidays, because I used to write columns on these books, and there would be commenters would say, this was the first book where I learned about Jews, or I learned about Judaism. And so I guess I'm wondering, Anna, Anna and Rebecca, what that was like to see the rituals. And I also went to a workman's circle, so I wasn't raised as a religious Jew. So I was interested in what that was like to come to that experience from a completely different background.
It meant that there were these cool rituals, and you got to eat weird-sounding food that seemed delicious, like ham and taschen, and that there were like candles lit, and that the girls enjoyed it, as opposed to in my family where my mom tried to get us to go to church for Christmas, and I would kick and scream and not want to go. So that was like my experience of religion through those books, was that, oh, Judaism seems really cool, as opposed to what we were not devout Christians. We just went at Christmas, and that was about it. But it made me very fascinated with I don't know, it made me fascinated with Judaism, but not as a religion. It was more of a cultural thing than a religious thing. And my dad was also very fascinated by Jewish culture, and would drive us 75 miles to the Bay Area to go to a Jewish deli, just so we could have matzo ball soup and pastrami. I'm sure like that stuff is available in my hometown now, but back then it was like you had to drive 2 hours to get it. And I think that his fascination with Jewish culture was in large part because he was, with my mom, an activist in the civil rights movement, and most of the people who were not African American who were activists in the civil rights movement were Jewish men and women, or Jewish boys and girls, I should say. A lot of them were teenagers. So I think that he felt a kinship with American Jews and transferred that to me, and that was only strengthened by the literature that I wrote, much of which featured young Jewish boys or girls, often living in the East Coast, living lives I wanted to have.
I just remember being fascinated by the same food and cultural and party stuff. The interesting thing I found reading it to my 3.5-year-old, who's young for it but is totally into it, is it makes me realize there are a couple things. One, the girls have so much freedom, and to roam around the city, and these young girls. And at the beginning, I think that they're 5 to 13, and they are running out to the light. They're like, "See ya," and I mean, it makes me. I like the idea of that. I like it, and I look at my poor little 3.5-year-old who's never going to go anywhere until she's 18 without somebody watching her, because we live now. But the religion comes into that, in that I also think we're not religious in any direction. My husband and I are not religious. But when we're doing the stories, and again, I know I'm reading to a kid who's younger than, but when we read the Passover story, and then they're going to kill all the firstborn, and this little girl is looking at me like, for real? And I was like, it's a story. And her dad's like, and it actually made me think about somebody who wasn't raised with religion and the various violence, that gets rolled into those stories, and in a culture that I do think, to some degree, we talk about death and all that in our house, but where you don't have that religious education that includes these horror stories from the time kids are born. That's one of the things that I've thought about as I read it to her. There's a lot of violence in explaining why you're having the party, right? So that struck me as an adult reading to her.
Yeah, talk about a bris.
Yeah.
Did you want to?
I was just going to say that obviously I had the completely opposite experience in that I grew up in a Yiddish-speaking, quite observant home, and so it was like, wow, this is a book that was in the Norris Library, and it has in it things we do. And as opposed to Little House on the Prairie, which I loved, or Caddy Woodlawn, do you remember that? It was Wisconsin Girlhood, which I loved. And I wouldn't, or the Lois Linsky books, I wouldn't have given up the experience of reading those. It was wonderful to read about other people. But in this, it was like, I know this. Okay? This is validating in a way that I'd say almost nothing else in the larger culture at that time in that place did for me. And I sort of I could kind of trot off to the library feeling like, okay, this is okay.
Well, thank you all. No, stay. But I wanted to open up to questions from the audience. And I know that when you ask a question, it would be great to come up here and ask it so everyone can hear. So, yes.
You want us to come up?
Yeah.
Please
Yeah.
come up. This is really fascinating, and I loved All of a Kind Family. I run a Jewish children's book club uptown, and I was really interested on how to bring, in general, Jewish historic stories and stories of immigrants to children your age, maybe 4th, 5th graders and up, 3rd, 4th, 5th graders, because the experiences of these girls are actually pretty removed even from the grandparents of these young children. So it seems like, reading about Little House on the, it seems so like long ago, they can't believe it. So I'm encouraged to hear that you may have some plans for lessons and links to, and because I'm sort of remembering my father grew up down the street from here, so that's very real, and so the book was so real for me, and the pickle place and the this place and that place. But the kids that I run into in New York don't have that connection. So anyway.
Yeah, come here.
I don't, right. They come here.
Come here.
So my question is, was that sort of on your mind as you reissued this book?
Oh, yes, definitely. I mean, when I say that it's a Jewish Little House on the Prairie, I don't only mean because of the food and the dresses, but because, it's really the same thing in that it's a part of American history that we just would never see if it weren't for these 5 books. There's no narrative that includes all of this together from the point of view of a family. It just doesn't exist. So, yeah, that was definitely one of the reasons I wanted to bring it back. I mean, besides the fact that I love them, but that it's just they're singular.
I have a question that's actually related to what you just said. I have to say my favorite story is when Henny dyes her dress with the tea.
Yeah, the tea.
I was always trying to think of things I could dye with tea. But my question, you've all sort of talked about the specificity of the Jewishness of the story, and I was thinking about it from the other side, and part of why I wanted to do this event here is because I feel like one of the things that these books do is present this very Jewish story also as an American immigrant story. They kind of present it as part of the American story, which I think is part of what the Tenement Museum does so well, is take these ethnic-specific stories and talk about them as an American story. So I was wondering if any of you could talk a little bit about how these books have worked that way, either historically or in your own framework.
June has a lot to say about that because it's in the forwards. Some of the background on that.
Well, I think there's the family story is extremely emblematic of the Jewish immigrant and the immigrant to America story, and it's sort of I wouldn't say repressed, but it's sort of underplayed in the books. But were you asking? You were asking how if that we consider that part of the books? Yes, they're very much. The first article I published about her was called "Becoming an All-of-a-Kind American" and strategies of assimilation in the all-of-a-kind family. And assimilation is happening, but it's not happening on the surface level of the stories. But there's a time in a later book where they go to Far Rockaway Beach and they go to a synagogue where the men and women sit together, and the father makes some crack about, well, I like my synagogue where the men sit separately, and then they're like, ha ha, Dad. So I mean, that's all there, but it's somewhat underplayed. But for sure you could use these books in any kind of lesson plan or to talk about immigration to America through a particular lens.
Yes, you want to come up?
Well, I just wanted to respond directly to that question of other immigrant experiences. So my father was an immigrant to the United States. He came somewhere around 1970, married an American woman, had 2 daughters who had this literary imagination that until we got to high school and read the British classics, which he was bizarrely attached to for someone Indian, he didn't have insight into our world. And so he would read the books that we brought home from the library on Friday afternoons. Shortly before he died, he asked if we could go to De Smet, where you can do Laura Ingalls Wilder tourism. And this book, The All of a Kind Family, was a book that he used as a jumping off place to talk to us about what it was like to be an immigrant. Now, he was not an immigrant as a child, he was not an immigrant at the same time, but it was a way that he could use to explain when things are like weird to Papa and Mama. he would use that to say, so sometimes your life is weird to me. And it is true that he always used the Jewish immigrant story as his sort of touchstone for relating stories, but this book was really central. Thank you.
I may be, with my gray hair, the only person here who actually knew the children of the All of a Kind family. I met them 70 years ago. I'm 77. Sid Taylor, as we knew her. We didn't know Sarah. Hello, Professor Cummins. The last time I saw you was on a beach at a lake when we had a Sedgwick Camp reunion, and we talked about this. So we have had email there, so I'm sort of a ringer here a little bit. Full disclosure. I was 7 years old. I was at Camp Sedgwick, which is Central Jewish Institute, Port Jervis, New York. Sid Taylor was my dance counselor. I apologize. I have zero talent. But the reason I was chosen to act in a James Thurber play called The Great Quillo was because I was one of the few kids that could actually memorize lines and lyrics. No talent, but I had a good, verbal memory. And Ella sewed my costume. Henny ironed it. God help me, I do not have it. It would be worth a fortune. We did children's plays. We did choreography. I knew Ralph as Uncle Ralph because everyone was aunt and uncle then with their first names. On Shabbat, the Oneg Shabbat, we went to the grassy area and Uncle Ralph played the recorder and we sang and we danced. They danced, I watched. Israeli and Israel culture was also at that point coming in. It was 1945. I was blessed to be of the generation that created Israel, and we had many people that went back and forth, and this was a large portion of what we did. Several decades later, a wonderful drama counselor, Marvin Turbin, wrote a play based on the book called All of a Kind Family, odd title, and the three living sisters came to camp, and we had the premiere on stage. We had maybe 500-600 people in the audience, and they front row seats, they watched their life on stage with the children who were playing them. And the arguments continued. Henny at one point ran our dining room. I mean, they all had various jobs. Ella was my head counselor. Sid was my dance counselor. Henny was in the dining room supervisor. And at one point, I became a waitress. I mean, you work your way all the way up. I became a waitress. I walked in, and in the back of the dining room, this big mess hall, Henny and Ella were having a furious argument because Henny had borrowed Ella's dress maybe 90 years ago and had gotten a stain and a rip. You forgot the rip part. Had ripped it. And they were still accusing each other who had not fixed the dress, who had worn it, who had done it. So their memories were still fresh. The library story, the library lady, of course, is one of my favorites, too, because I am a voracious reader, and I identify with that very clearly. One of the first camp libraries in the universe was established by Sid, Sarah, Ella, Henny, Charlotte. They all came. They brought their own books, and then parents on visiting day, in addition, you were supposed to tip the counselor a little. You were encouraged, bring a Jewish book for your child, which then got added to the camp library, and you could borrow it. And on Oneg Shabbat, I remember Sarah's voice reading to us and the others, and they would read various stories, not just their own. And of course, I knew Little House on the Prairie. I actually visited it when we went out to the West. So yeah, it's sort of a layered type of thing. The thing that I remember, I have autographed copies of their books, by the way. I read it to my children. My daughter at the time knew them also and danced at the very end of Sid's life. Sid put her in a production and danced. She was far better than I am. Danced a little bit for her. The thing one gets from this, and I'm a social studies teacher, guilty. So one of the things we do when we teach this, and I did teach this, I taught in boys' high school in Bedford-Stuyvesant, in Brooklyn, all boys, and I taught immigration, all of a kind family. And the boys said, girls, ugh! But I read the first chapter to them, and they got hooked instantly. Even if they didn't have sisters, they loved it. You can teach it anywhere, any level, high school, junior high, whatever it is. One of my favorite memories is traveling on the buses many years ago when the book was still in print and seeing children opening copies of All of a Kind, and I would say, I know them. So many of the stories that Sid writes about were living to me. The sisters were arguing the same way they did in Sid's books. So what do we take from it? Even the illustrations, which I agree are sort of maybe a little bit weird to contemporary times. Oh. My mother, who grew up on Pitt and Rivington Street, and her family, and there were 3 girls and a boy there, they wore starched aprons and petticoats to school. And so when my mother, who also worked at camp, when we read these stories, and it was like their childhood, that's what they remembered. It is a universal. The kids who I had as immigrants from China, from Hungary, from India, from Eastern Europe, who came in and who said, it's my family, like Fiddler on the Roof, translated into 57 languages, and one of its most popular productions is in Japan, and they say, how could you write such a Japanese story? So it's a universal human truth. I love them. I buy them when they were in print. I buy them as all my newborn, the female relatives, they all get All of a Kind family as a gift when they're first born. So my question, after all this, is, Professor Cummins, would you please finish so that in my lifetime I can read this?
All the way in the back. Oh, maybe.
No, we need you.
I'm actually a director of education at a synagogue, and when I was rushing to get out of Hebrew school tonight and running to come and very excited, some of my teachers who are college age and early grad school age were like, what is All of a Kind family? And it got me, and I realized that I've recommended it to, because we have, one of them came out in print again, and the Downtown book is actually a PJ Library book. Like they printed distributed as that. So we have that on our shelves, and I'd recommended it to a couple of kids. And the response was sort of, I know it's not going to be as excited as those of us who are in the room who are sort of addicted to it. But it wasn't what I had wanted or expected. And I'm wondering, sort of, as we talk about bringing it back in print and all of the lessons that everyone in this room has learned from it, how we engage a generation that's sort of a Hunger Games, vampire, whatever the other, all of those things, that's what they're reading, Harry Potter, those are the things that get them excited. How we engage them in this, which is not only our story, but as New York children, their story and where they live. What's the step? Because now the books are out and I can no longer say that, well, I can't find them. And now I'm very excited about that. But now they're here, so how do we get them to realize that this is a story that is actually something that they can engage with? And I don't know if anyone has an answer, but
Yeah. Do you want to come up also? Yeah, I was going to ask, is there an educator that also wants to talk about it?
I'm a mother, girls, and my father had a store across the street. My father had a store across the street at 96 Orchard selling ladies' underwear and children's clothing. So, of course, I got my summer pajamas in February, and I got my winter pajamas in July and couldn't wait to wear them. And I lived in Far Rockaway, and I read all the books. But what I wanted to say is I think Harry Potter proved that kids will read if they're interested. And I think if you're an educator, first of all, you assign the books. So you do that. And I think, again, how we're saying it's so universal. When I remember the crackers melting on the girls' tongues, and I remember Mama's rye bread and the butter, and and the vegetable soup when they had a dairy meal and things like that. So my grandparents were very Orthodox. My mother's an atheist, but we were culturally Jewish. So I just think you have to trust that the books are still so wonderful, and everybody has their own foods, and everybody has their own things, and I just think, to me, the mother was just this strong presence that was always working. And so I am just really saying I don't think there's a problem maybe with, who's the person who had the question? Oh, my goodness. Okay. I could understand, in Manhattan, maybe you think kids are jaded or that they're not. But I honestly feel, and I'm not allowed to walk. My daughters have, I can't remember what age I let my daughter walk, like 3 blocks somewhere, and I was terrified the whole way, because ever since Eton Pates and all that horror, we just don't let children walk. But, what did I want to say? God, I lost my train of thought. Give me a second. I think that we should trust in the books and the power of those books. And even those children who carry the $5 to get held up on the subway, or whatever it is in New York when you have a child, trust the books.
Okay, thank you.
That's what I just want to say.
I think we have one more.
I just want to say.
I'm sorry.
It's incredibly important. And
You guys are marketing it right now. You're our marketing.
I really have absolutely nothing of real value to say other than I think it's about marketing and how do you get the word out there? What's the sort of publicity campaign to make this the kind of phenomenon that so many other books become? There's nothing inherently better about those books. I think they get sort of beamed to the public in a way that the kid has to have it. So that's your, I think, chore.
Trying. We don't have millions of dollars to spend on it.
Can I just add one point to that? All of a Kind Family pitches much younger than Hunger Games. Yeah. You want to get them when they're young. And 7 and 6 and 5-year-olds will, yes. And there's no reason to be giving Hunger Games or Twilight to your 5-year-old. You can give them these books. So start with the younger ones.
Yeah, and I will say, as somebody who just read it to a kid who's really young, that it's great family reading. I mean, I read them to myself, right? And so that makes it a little older. But maybe especially in a moment where fiction, I think, has become more sophisticated, like further down the age, the chronology. So I think that these are totally well-suited to family reading at 4 and 5. I mean, maybe 3.5 is too early, but she was into it. She was totally into it. She wants to read the next one. So, 4 and 5-year-old reading at night, I think, is great to start these, as you would sort of with Little House. I think of Little House as being for much younger readers.
Yeah. I hope you're selling Little House also. I hope you have it in the store. I think. Oh, is this the last question? Okay.
Far be it from me to have the last word, but I will say that Esther, who I know is sitting in the front row, you want to raise your hand, Esther? Esther brought her mom, Francine, here today. And Esther, you're 7, right? And you had read the book? 9. I'm so sorry. My bad. So in terms of young readers engaging in the book on their own. I just had a question about the book, and really as a literary venture. I was curious how successful it was in its original publication, how it went out of print, and was it a battle to get it reissued, or were publishers eager to sign up for that?
Oh, well, June can answer the other questions, but I can talk about the reissues. Actually, it was not, in some ways, I mean, it was not a battle, because the publisher had dropped them. They only wanted them in Kindle. And that is something that has actually happened to a lot of girls series and a lot of classic young adult fiction. We're trying to bring back also books like The Great Brains. There's just a whole, I know, we'll see what happens. But, there are all of these books, and I think it does speak to maybe the Hunger Games problem, which is that, you do have these books that kids like, but then you also have these books that we love, that we know they should read. And so, the idea is to just sort of have them here for you, to be able to pass them down. And I know June can talk about the earlier publishing history.
It's very hard to get sales numbers for 50 years ago, but I do think that All of a Kind Family, the first book, was never out of print. There was a time when the books were being issued in paperback. Women had the paperback rights. A few years ago, who picked it up, the hardcover? One of the big publishers put out a hardcover edition of All of a Kind Family with an introduction by Francine Prose. But the paperback books were out of print for not that long. It was only about 5 years. And I had people writing me left and right, get these books back into print. My mother bought a $45 used library book for her my niece, her granddaughter, people were desperate for them. So really, for all intents and purposes, they were always in print, and it's not like there were years and years where they were not available. Only recently were they not available. Until Lizzie.
Yeah. Okay, I think that's it. Thank you so much for coming.